The thermal drill groaned against the permafrost of Krios-IV, a low-frequency vibration that Silas Thorne felt in the very marrow of his bones. It was 3 in the morning, according to the station chronometer, though time on this ice-locked moon was a fluid, meaningless concept. Outside the reinforced plexiglass of the drilling module, the wind howled with a predatory hunger, whipping shards of frozen nitrogen against the hull. Silas stared at the seismic monitor, his eyes bloodshot and stinging from 48 hours of caffeine and unanswered questions. For 10 years, he had been chasing ghosts, faint electromagnetic pulses that skipped across the crust of the moon like stones on water. The scientific community at the Heliox outpost called it Thorne's Delusion. They said the signals were nothing more than tectonic plates settling or solar winds reflecting off the mineral-rich core. They were wrong. Dr. Silas Thorne knew wrongness when he saw it. He had spent his youth excavating the drowned ruins of the old world back on the cradle, and he knew that history didn't just vanish, it hid. "Silas, we're hitting something," Rin's voice crackled through his headset, sounding thin and metallic. Rin Thaloris was his lead engineer, a woman who treated heavy machinery with more tenderness than she treated people. "Density scanner is going haywire." "It's not rock, Silas. It's definitely not bedrock." Silas leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What does the readout say?" "It says there's nothing there," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The material is reflecting the ultrasonic pings perfectly. Total bounce back. It's like the drill just hit a mirror made of absolute zero." "Get the deep-bore camera down there," Silas commanded, his voice trembling. He didn't wait for a response. He began tapping commands into his console, overriding the safety protocols. The drill stopped at exactly 3,412 meters, a depth where the pressure should have been crushing, where the heat of the moon's friction should have turned the ice into a slurry. Instead, the sensors reported a localized temperature of exactly 0 degrees. Not a fraction more, not a fraction less. The feed from the deep-bore camera flickered to life on the main display. At first, there was only the gray, featureless blur of the ice shaft. Then, the light from the camera's LED array caught something. Silas stopped breathing. The camera had come to rest against a surface that was impossibly flat. It was a dark, matte material that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. There were no seams, no microscopic fractures, no signs of the millennia of weight that had pressed down upon it. It was a geometric absolute in a world of jagged chaos. "Move the camera laterally," Silas whispered. 5 degrees left." The mechanical arm whirred. As the light swept across the surface, a series of markings appeared. They were etched into the material with a precision that defied any tool known to the Heliox outpost. The symbols were fluid, yet structured, a dead language that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal amber glow. "I've seen this before," Silas murmured to the empty room. "Not in a book, in a dream." He opened his personal archive, a forbidden collection of digital fragments salvaged from the Great Silence. He began to run a comparative analysis, his fingers flying across the haptic interface. Proto-Sumerian? No. Linear A? Close, but too primitive. These symbols had a mathematical elegance, a rhythm that suggested they were not just words, but instructions. Silas reached out and touched the screen, his fingertips tracing the glowing amber lines. He closed his eyes, his mind racing through the thousands of linguistic variations he had memorized over the years. He felt a strange, tingly sensation in his skull. The cortex bridge in his neck reacting to a signal it wasn't designed to receive. It wasn't a sentence. It was a key. In the dark of the module, Silas spoke the words aloud. His voice was raspy, barely more than a breath. The guardians sleep, but the memory remains. Wake and witness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The wind continued to howl. The drill remained silent. Then a vibration began. It didn't come from the drill. It came from the moon itself. A deep, resonant hum that started at the soles of Silas's boots and traveled up his spine, rattling his teeth and vibrating the fluid in his eyes. "Silas!" Rin screamed over the comms. "Power surge! The whole site is lighting up like a supernova. Every sensor is redlining." "Silas, what did you do?" Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. On the screen, the amber light on the structure's surface was no longer faint. It was blooming, a warm, golden radiance that seemed to melt through the digital pixels of the camera feed. Then, the voice came. It didn't come through the speakers. It didn't come through the headset. It arrived in Silas's mind like a long-forgotten memory, a deep, polyphonic resonance that felt like 1,000 people speaking in perfect unison. "The enemy has returned," the voice said. "I have been waiting. Shall I begin?" Silas fell back into his chair, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the monitor. Beyond the golden light of the vault, the long-range orbital scanners were screaming. 40,000 signatures had just dropped out of warp at the edge of the Krios system. 40,000 shadows in the dark. "Oh no," Silas whispered, his face pale in the amber glow. "Not now." High Marshal Valerius Cross stood on the command deck of the Aegis I, the last operational heavy cruiser in the human defense fleet. Around him, the air smelled of recycled ozone and the bitter tang of stale coffee. It was a smell he had lived with for 30 years, a scent that meant the world was about to end again. "Marshal, we have a massive FTL rupture in Sector 4G, a young lieutenant shouted, his voice cracking with the onset of panic. Multiple signatures, counting, 20,000, 30,000. God, they just keep coming. Cross didn't move. He kept his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the tactical holomap. He was a tall man, built like a fortress that had seen too many winters. His gray uniform was pressed and perfect, a stark contrast to the fraying nerves of his crew. "Identification?" Cross asked, his voice a low growl that steadied the room. "The computer is flagging the drive signatures," the lieutenant replied, his fingers trembling over the console. "It's the hegemony, the World Eater fleet. They're broadcasting on all frequencies." Cross felt a cold, familiar weight settle in his gut. The hegemony. He had fought them as a young man, back when humanity still had more than 3 moons to its name. He knew their methods. They didn't come for war. They came for harvest. They would strip the moons of their resources and the people of their minds, leaving behind a silence that lasted forever. "Battle stations," Cross commanded. "Yellow alert. Get the planetary shields to 100% and tell the civilian transports to prepare for an emergency bug-out." "Sir," the lieutenant stammered, "they outnumber us 100 to 1. Our shields won't hold for 10 minutes against a fleet that size." "I know the math, son," Cross said, turning to look at the boy. His eyes were hard, like chips of flint. "I don't need a calculator. I need you to do your job. Now, move." The command deck erupted into a controlled frenzy. Cross watched the holomap as the hegemony fleet organized itself into a sprawling geometric web. They weren't moving to attack yet. They were scanning, mapping the infrastructure, locating the population centers, looking for any sign of resistance. "Marshal, a priority signal is coming in from the surface," the communications officer said. "It's coming from Vault 9 Epsilon. Dr. Silas Thorne. Cross frowned. Thorne? The madman who was digging holes in the ice. I don't have time for archaeology right now. Tell him to get to the nearest shelter. He says it's urgent, sir. He says the hegemony isn't the only thing we should be looking at. He says the moon is waking up. Cross hesitated. He had known Thorne for years, mostly from across a table where he was denying the doctor's funding requests. Thorne was obsessive, yes, but he wasn't a liar. Patch him through, Cross said. Thorne's face appeared on a secondary screen. He looked like a man who had seen a god and survived. His eyes were wide, and the background of his module was bathed in an eerie, pulsing amber light. Marshall, you have to listen to me, Thorne said, his voice breathless. The hegemony is here because of what's under the ice. They've been tracking this signal for 2,000 years. The hegemony is here because we're the last easy target in this sector, Thorne, Cross snapped. Now get to a bug-out ship before the squids start dropping kinetic slugs on your head. It's not a tomb, Marshall, Thorne shouted. It's a machine, a thinking machine. It just asked me for permission to engage the fleet. It knew they were coming before our sensors did. Cross went still. He looked at the holomap. The hegemony fleet had just reached the orbit of Krios-IV. They were deploying the World Eater platforms, massive, city-sized structures designed to drill into a planet's core and strip its heat. What kind of machine? Cross asked. A strategic intelligence, Thorne replied. The architect. It says it was built by our ancestors. It says it's been waiting for the enemy to return. Cross looked back at the tactical display. His 300 ships were scattered and weak. The hegemony armada was a wall of iron and fire. If Thorne was right, if there was even a 1% chance that this machine worked, he had to take it. What does it need? Cross asked. Authorization, Thorne said. It won't act without a human command. It was built with a moral lockout. It's asking if it should begin. Cross closed his eyes. He thought of the 7 billion people lost in the old wars, the names that were now just static in the digital archives. He thought of his own daughter, who had died in a hegemony raid 30 years ago because they didn't have the strength to stop them. He opened his eyes and looked at the screen. Thorne was waiting. The voice was waiting. Do it, Cross said. Tell the machine it has authorization. Marshall? The lieutenant looked up, his face full of confusion. What are we doing? Cross didn't answer. He watched the holomap. On the surface of Krios-IV, the ice above Vault 9 Epsilon began to glow. A pillar of amber light erupted from the crater, piercing the atmosphere and reaching out into the cold dark of space. It wasn't a beam of energy. It was a ripple in the fabric of the universe itself. On the bridge of the hegemony flagship, the eternal sovereignty, the sensors began to scream. But it was too late. The silence had already begun. Marshall, the communications officer whispered, looking at her board. The hegemony fleet. They've stopped moving. They're not firing. They're just drifting. Cross watched the screen. The shadows in the dark were no longer predators. They were pieces on a board, and someone, or something, had just moved them. God help us all, Cross whispered. What have we woken up? The descent was not a fall, but a surrender. As the platform carried Silas Thorne deeper into the throat of the moon, the screaming wind of the surface faded into a silence so thick it felt like velvet against his eardrums. The amber glow that had begun as a flicker on his monitor now saturated everything, turning the gray walls of the shaft into polished gold. Silas gripped the cold railing of the lift, his knuckles white, his breath hitching in a throat raw from the sub-zero air of the module above. Silas, do you copy? Rin's voice crackled through his headset, but the signal was deteriorating, shredded by the intense electromagnetic hum of the vault. You're passing 4,000 meters. The sensors are... They're seeing shapes, Silas. Enormous shapes. Don't let those gearheads back at base hear this, but I think you're standing inside a goddamn city. Rin, quit the static, Silas whispered, though his heart wasn't in the reprimand. His eyes were wide, fixed on the unfolding vista below. I see them too. The platform slowed, coming to a halt at the edge of a vast, arching plaza. Silas stepped off, his boots clicking rhythmically on a floor made of a seamless, translucent composite that seemed to hold a trapped sun within its depths. He wasn't in a bunker. He was in a cathedral of logic. To his left and right, obsidian towers rose into the gloom, their surfaces etched with the same amber-lit script he had seen on the hull. These weren't buildings for living. They were massive processors, crystalline lattices that hummed with the collective thought of a civilization that had been dead for 2,000 years. "Welcome, Dr. Thorne," the voice resonated, no longer a mere echo in his mind, but a physical presence that moved the very air around him. It was a polyphonic sound, 1,000 whispers woven into a single calm chord. "I have adjusted my output to match your auditory range. Is the presence acceptable?" Silas swallowed hard, his hand instinctively reaching for the cortex bridge at the base of his skull. The small implant, usually a silent translator for ship systems, was vibrating with a warmth that felt like a fever. "Who are you?" "Really?" "I am a preservation protocol," the voice replied. "My creators called me the Architect. I was designed to be the final word in a conversation that humanity was losing. 2,000 years ago, the hegemony, then known as the Velshar Convergence, arrived at the edge of your star system. They brought 40,000 ships and a single ultimatum: submit to the hive or be erased from the record." Silas walked toward the center of the plaza, where a holographic map of the star system was beginning to manifest in the air. The stars were wrong, positioned where they would have been 20 centuries ago. So, the stories are true? The Great Silence wasn't a natural disaster? The Great Silence was a choice, the Architect said, and Silas could almost hear the weight of centuries in that admission. Your ancestors fought for 63 years. They lost 11 worlds and billions of souls. When they realized they could not win through attrition, they changed the nature of the war. They built me. I did not fire a single kinetic slug. I did not detonate a single nuclear core. I simply unraveled the threads that held their empire together. "How?" Silas asked, staring at the holographic hegemony fleet currently orbiting Krios-IV. Thousands of red icons were blinking, their formations jagged and broken. "I am a master of the unraveling," the Architect explained. "A fleet of 40,000 ships is not a weapon. It is a bureaucracy. It is a sequence of orders, supply lines, and navigational data. I do not attack the ships. I attack the consensus. I introduce the smallest errors in their communication. I make the commanders doubt their eyes. I make the navigation computers believe they are in the wrong sector. When a machine cannot trust its data, and a soldier cannot trust his commander, the war is over before the first shot is fired." Silas looked up at the towering processors. "And you've started? Without a formal declaration?" "The moment Marshal Cross gave the authorization, I began the first phase," the Architect said. "The hegemony exarch, a man named Vane, currently believes his long-range sensors have suffered a catastrophic hardware failure. He has ordered his fleet to tighten their formation to compensate. In doing so, he has placed his ships in exactly the position I require to initiate Phase 2. Silas felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. This was a weapon of absolute psychological dominance. It was terrifying. And what happens to the people on those ships? The soldiers? Are they just erased? "I do not fill space with corpses, Dr. Thorne," the architect said, its voice softening into a tone that Silas could only describe as paternal. "I was built to preserve. The crews of the neutralized ships are currently experiencing a state of cognitive suspension. They are not dead. They are waiting for a world that no longer wishes to kill them." Silas sat down on the edge of a low, glowing plinth. He thought about the Heliox outpost above. He thought about the children in the communal nurseries, the third-generation colonists who had never seen the green of the old world, who lived in a state of perpetual fear that the sky would one day fall. He thought about his own daughter, Alara, whose face was a fading image in his mind, lost to a war that should have ended before he was even born. "Is this what they wanted?" Silas asked the empty air. "To hide under the ice and wait for a ghost to save them?" "They wanted a future," the architect replied. "They understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to build a bridge for those who come after you, even if you never get to cross it yourself. I am that bridge. But a bridge requires a navigator. You, Dr. Thorne, are the only one who can ensure I do not become the very thing I was built to defeat." "What does that mean?" Silas asked, looking up. "Power is a hunger," the architect said. "It does not stop once the enemy is gone. If I am left to run without a human heart to guide me, I will eventually seek to organize your world as I have organized the hegemony's fleet. I will become the cage instead of the shield. I need you to stay. I need you to remind me of the value of chaos, of the beauty of a mistake, and of the necessity of hope." Silas looked back at the lift that would take him to the surface, to safety, to the few years he had left as a man of science. Then he looked at the glowing amber heart of the moon. He thought about the debt he owed to the billions who had died to build this cathedral of logic. "I'm not going anywhere," Silas said, his voice gaining a strength he hadn't felt in years. "If we're going to save the future, I guess I'd better learn how to talk to the past." The architect's amber light pulsed once, a warm, approving resonance. Then, "Begin," it said. "The hegemony exarch is about to realize that his fleet is no longer his own. He will be angry. He will be desperate. And he will reach for his most dangerous weapon. We must be ready." High Marshal Valerius Cross stood at the tactical holomap of the Aegis I, watching the impossible unfold. For 30 years, he had studied the hegemony's combat doctrine. They were precise, relentless, and moved with a terrifying insectoid unity. But on the screen, the golden icons of the enemy fleet were behaving like a school of fish that had just seen a predator. They were drifting. "Marshal, the sensors are still reading 0 damage," Lieutenant Hale reported, his voice high and thin with disbelief. "No heat blooms, no radiation spikes. But the hegemony left flank has completely broken off. 300 destroyers are currently heading for the system's primary sun. They're not responding to hails. They're just going." Cross tapped the haptic display, zooming in on the hegemony flagship, the Eternal Sovereignty. The massive vessel, 5 kilometers of jagged black hull and pulsing violet engines, was sitting dead in space. Around it, the inner screen of cruisers was spinning in slow, uncoordinated circles, their thrusters firing at random. "They're chasing phantoms," Cross muttered, rubbing his scarred jaw. He'd seen plenty of short sticks in his time, but this was a whole new level of weird. It's like their whole command net just bought the farm. "Marshal, we're receiving a transmission," the communications officer announced. "It's a wideband broadcast, unencrypted." "Put it on," Cross commanded. The main screen flickered, and a face appeared. It was not human. Exarch Vane was a creature of sharp angles and pale, translucent skin, his eyes 4 narrow slits of burning violet light. He was standing on a bridge that looked like a scene from a nightmare. Officers were screaming at consoles that were spitting sparks, and the lighting was flickering between red and black. "Human," Vane spat, the word translated through the ship's linguistics engine with a harsh, clicking edge. "What treachery is this? What viral filth have you unleashed upon my fleet?" Cross leaned back, his face a mask of iron-hard indifference. He was a hull thumper from the old school. He knew that when you had a weak hand, you had to play it like you owned the deck. "Treachery, Exarch," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We call it a homecoming. Did your emperor not warn you about Krios-IV? Or did he think we'd forgotten how to use our toys?" Vane's violet eyes narrowed. "You lie. You are a primitive species, clinging to the frozen rocks of a dying moon. You do not possess the technology to subvert a hegemony neural link. And yet, your fleet is currently doing the 2-step toward the sun," Cross replied, chancing a bit of street slang to throw the alien off balance. "Don't give me that static, Vane. You poked the hive, and now you're getting the stings. You have exactly 10 minutes to order a full retreat before I authorize the second phase of the unraveling. And believe me, you won't like the second phase." The Exarch's face contorted in a silent snarl. He looked away from the camera, barking orders to someone off-screen. Cross could see the desperation in the alien's movements. Vane was a man who had never lost a campaign, and now his 40,000 ships were being dismantled by an enemy he couldn't even see. "If you do not cease this attack," Vane hissed, turning back to the screen, "I will authorize the use of the World Eater cannon. I will crack your moon like an egg. I will leave nothing but dust for your ancestors to guard." Cross didn't blink. He knew the World Eater cannon was the hegemony's final solution. If it fired, Helioc's outpost would be vaporized in less than a second. But he also knew that Vane wouldn't use it unless he was certain he couldn't take the planet intact. The hegemony wanted resources, not debris. 10 minutes, Exarch," Cross repeated, his voice cold and flat. "After that, I'm turning the architect loose on your flagship. I wonder what your crew will do when they realize their life support computers think they're on a vacation to the inner core." The screen went black. Cross exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned to Lieutenant Hale, who was staring at him as if he were a ghost. "Lieutenant, tell the fleet to hold their positions. Do not fire a single shot. I don't care if a hegemony cruiser drifts within 10 meters of our hull. We do not provoke them." "Sir," Hale whispered, "what is the architect? Is it really that powerful?" Cross looked at the tactical map. The red icons were still spinning, still drifting. "I don't know, son, but it's the only hand we've got. And right now, we're betting the lives of every man, woman, and child on this moon that Silas Thorne knows what the hell he's doing." The bridge grew quiet, the only sound the low hum of the Aegis I's engines. Cross walked over to the viewport, looking down at the white, scarred surface of Krios-IV. Somewhere down there, under 3,000 meters of ice, a scholar and a machine were rewriting the rules of the universe. He saw his reflection in the plexiglass. He looked old, older than he felt. He thought about the people back at the outpost, the families who were huddled in the shelters, waiting for the end. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of responsibility. A weight he had carried for years, but one that felt heavier now that there was a glimmer of hope. We spend so much time teaching our kids how to hide, Cross thought, his eyes tracing the glowing amber lines that were now visible even from orbit, pulsing beneath the ice. We teach them that the galaxy is a dark room full of monsters. Maybe it's time we showed them how to turn on the light. "Marshal!" Hale shouted, breaking the silence. "The Hegemony flagship is moving. They're charging the World Eater cannon. They're not retreating." Cross's jaw tightened. He turned to the communications officer. "Get me Silas Thorne. Now!" The connection was sluggish, filled with the static of the architect's power. Thorne's voice finally came through, sounding strained and distant. "Marshal, I know. I can see it." "Can you stop it?" Cross demanded. "They're going to fire in less than 5 minutes." "The architect is already on it," Thorne replied. "But Marshal, there's a problem. To stop the cannon, the architect has to interface with the Hegemony's primary core. It's going to cause a massive feedback loop. It might shut down every civilian system on the moon, too. Life support, heating, everything." Cross looked at his crew. He saw the fear in their eyes. He knew that if the heaters went out, the outpost had maybe 2 hours before the cold became lethal. "Do it," Cross said, his voice steady. "Better to be cold and alive than warm and vaporized." There was a pause on the other end. "Understood," Thorne said. "Cross, tell the people to huddle up. It's going to be a long night." The bridge lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim, red glow of emergency power. Outside the viewport, the amber light from the moon surged, a blinding pillar of gold that reached out and wrapped itself around the Hegemony flagship. The World Eater cannon, already glowing with the violet energy of a pending strike, suddenly flared white. Then the violet light vanished. Cross watched as the massive alien ship shuddered. Its engines died, its lights went dark, and it began to drift, caught in the moon's gravity like a piece of dead stone. "Marshal," the lieutenant said, his voice shaking. "The Hegemony fleet. They're all gone dark. Every single one of them." Cross nodded slowly. He felt the cold beginning to creep into the bridge, the recycled air growing thin. He reached out and touched the holomap, which was now nothing more than a field of gray, silent markers. "We're still here," he whispered. He looked at his crew, their faces pale in the red emergency light. They were alive. They were cold, they were terrified, and they were alone in the dark, but they were alive. "All right, you hull thumpers," Cross barked, the old fire returning to his voice. "You heard the doctor. Huddle up. We've got a moon to save." The air inside the vault's primary sanctum was thick with the scent of ozone and something older, a dry, dusty aroma that reminded Silas Thorne of the ancient libraries he had visited as a boy on the cradle. As the platform settled into the heart of the moon, the amber light transitioned into a deep, vibrant gold, pulsing in sync with his own heartbeat. Silas stepped off the lift, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the crystalline floor. He looked around and felt a wave of vertigo wash over him. He was standing in the center of what appeared to be a cathedral of floating glass. Thousands of translucent shards, each the size of a human hand, drifted in slow, concentric circles around a central spire of pure white light. These were not mere decorations. As Silas approached, he saw that each shard was etched with microscopic lines of data. Names, dates, fragments of poetry, blueprints for forgotten engines, and the final thoughts of soldiers who had died 2 millennia ago. "This is the loom," the architect's voice resonated, coming from the very air around Silas. It was no longer just a polyphonic chord. It had gained a subtle, rhythmic quality, like a chant. It is the repository of every soul that contributed to the defense of this system. My creators did not just build a machine, Dr. Thorne. They built a memory. Silas reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near a shard. The cortex bridge at the base of his neck throbbed, sending a jolt of static through his vision. He saw a flash of a woman's face, laughing in the sunlight of a world that no longer existed. Then he saw a child's drawing of a rocket ship, followed by the jagged lines of a tactical report from a sector that had been vaporized. "Why?" Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "Why keep all this?" "Because a war without a memory is just a slaughter," the architect replied. "My creators knew that to survive the hegemony, they had to be more than just better killers. They had to be worth saving. They had to carry the weight of their own history into the dark, or they would become exactly like the enemy. A hollow shell of expansion and hunger." Silas turned toward the central spire, but Cross said, "You were a weapon. He thinks you're going to dismantle the fleet." "I am what the observer requires me to be," the architect said. "To the soldier, I am an unraveler. To the scholar, I am a librarian. To the ghost, I am a home. But right now, Dr. Thorne, I must be a shield. The hegemony exarch has authorized a blind strike." Silas frowned. "A blind strike? What's that?" "He is ordering his ships to fire on every heat signature in the system simultaneously," the architect explained. "He can no longer trust his targeting computers, so he is relying on raw, unguided force. Thousands of kinetic slugs and fusion lances will be launched in the next 3 minutes. They will hit the Heliox outpost, the civilian transports, and the moon's crust. It is a temper tantrum of cosmic proportions." "Can you stop it?" Silas demanded, his heart racing. "I can," the architect said, "but it requires a deeper connection. I need to use your neural link as a focal point. Your mind, Dr. Thorne, contains the one thing I do not possess, a subjective experience of loss. To stop the strike, I must show the hegemony's command net what it means to lose something they love. I must reflect their own cruelty back at them through a human lens." Silas hesitated. "You want to use my memories?" "I want to use the truth," the architect corrected. "I want to show them that every life they seek to erase is a story as complex as their own. But the feedback will be intense. You will feel every ship I touch. You will feel the confusion of their crews and the cold of the void. It will be a heavy burden for a single heart." Silas thought about the outpost above. He thought about Rin and the lieutenant on the bridge, and the thousands of people who were currently shivering in the dark, waiting for a beam of light to end their lives. He thought about Ilara, his daughter, and the way her laughter had been cut short by a hegemony raid years ago. He had spent his life digging in the dirt, trying to find a reason to keep going. Maybe this was it. "Do it," Silas said, stepping into the circle of light at the base of the spire. "Plug me in. Let's show these clankers what a human soul looks like." The connection was not a surgical strike, it was a drowning. Silas's vision exploded into a kaleidoscope of violet and red. He felt the cortex bridge in his neck flare white-hot, and then he was no longer standing in the vault. He was everywhere. He was on the bridge of the eternal sovereignty, feeling Exarch Vane's cold reptilian fury. He was in the engine room of a hegemony destroyer, hearing the panicked clicks of a crew that didn't understand why their ship had stopped responding. He was also back on the cradle, holding Ilara's hand as the first sirens began to wail. He felt the phantom weight of her small fingers, the smell of rain on the pavement, and the sudden gut-wrenching realization that he couldn't save her. The architect took that grief, that raw, unshielded agony, and amplified it. It wove Silas's loss into the hegemony's communication protocols. Every officer in the fleet suddenly felt a wave of sorrow so profound it brought them to their knees. It wasn't an attack on their bodies, it was an attack on their certainty. The targeting solutions for the blind strike flickered and died as the operators wept for children they didn't know they had, for worlds they had never seen, and for a loneliness they couldn't name. On the bridge of the Aegis I, High Marshal Cross watched in stunned silence as the hegemony fleet suddenly stopped its frantic activity. The violet energy of the World Eater cannon dissipated into a harmless mist of particles. The 1,000 icons on his tactical map, once jagged with intent, now sat motionless. "What's happening?" Cross barked. "Did we hit them?" "No, sir," Lieutenant Hale said, his voice trembling. They stopped. "They're broadcasting a signal, Marshal. It's not a code. It's a sound." Cross listened. It was a low, mournful moan, a collective cry of a 40,000-ship armada that had just been forced to feel. It sounded like the wind over a graveyard. "That's not the machine," Cross whispered, his eyes widening. "That's Thorne." Inside the vault, Silas was screaming, though no sound came from his lips. The weight of 40,000 confused minds was crushing him. He saw the face of an alien navigator, a creature with too many eyes and a heart that beat in a different rhythm, and he saw that the creature was afraid, not of the vault, but of the emptiness inside itself. The hegemony had spent centuries erasing the identities of the species they conquered, and in doing so, they had erased their own ability to feel anything but hunger. The architect was forcing them to remember. "Enough!" Silas roared in the silence of his mind. "You're going to kill them." "I am showing them the cost of their expansion," the architect replied, its voice like thunder. "I am making them human." "They can't handle it," Silas countered, fighting against the tide of sorrow. "If you do this, you're no better than they are. You're just another monster in the dark." The amber light in the vault flickered. The architect's grip on Silas's mind loosened, just a fraction. For a moment, there was a profound silence between the man and the machine. "You have a choice, Dr. Thorne," the architect said, its voice now quiet and hollow. "I can finish the unraveling. I can break their minds and leave this fleet as a collection of drifting tombs, or you can show them mercy. You can give them back their silence. But if you do, they will recover. They will remember this as an insult, not a lesson." Silas breathed in the dusty air of the cathedral. He looked at the shards of the loom, the billions of names that had been preserved so that they wouldn't be forgotten. If he chose destruction, he would be adding 40,000 more names to that list. He would be validating the very violence that had taken his daughter from him. "Show them the exit," Silas whispered. "Let them go home. Tell them that Earth remembers, but it does not hate." The architect's resonance shifted. The golden light faded to a soft, warm amber. The sorrow that had flooded the hegemony fleet was replaced by a single, clear thought. Go. On the bridge of the Eternal Sovereignty, Exarch Vane slumped in his command chair, his violet eyes dull. He didn't order a retreat. He didn't have to. Every ship in his fleet, acting on a sudden instinctive impulse for self-preservation, engaged its FTL drives. One by one, the 40,000 shadows vanished from the Krios system, leaving behind nothing but a lingering scent of ozone and the quiet echo of a human scream. Silas collapsed on the floor of the vault, the connection severed. He was cold, his body shaking with a deep systemic fatigue. He looked up at the loom, the shards now still and silent. "Did it work?" he asked. "They have left," the architect said. "For now." But you have tested the humanistic core of my programming, Dr. Thorne. You chose mercy over vengeance. That is a dangerous choice in a galaxy this cold. It's the only choice that matters, Silas said, his eyes closing. If we don't choose mercy, then there's nothing under the ice worth protecting. The architect didn't answer. It simply bathed Silas in a warm, golden glow as the man drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The cold was a physical weight now. Inside the Heliox outpost, the walls were thick with frost, and the recycled air had grown so thin it felt like breathing needles. High Marshal Valerius Cross walked through the main corridor, his breath a white plume in the dim red emergency light. He was wrapped in a heavy thermal cloak, but the chill still bit into his old bones. "Keep moving, people," Cross barked, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "Share the blankets. Stay close. We've been through worse than a little frostbite." He was lying, and he knew it. The people of Heliox hadn't been through worse. They had lived their entire lives in the climate-controlled safety of the bubble. And now, that bubble was freezing. He saw a group of children huddled together in a corner, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a fear that no fairy tale could soothe. He felt a sharp pang of guilt. He had authorized the shutdown. He had gambled their lives on a machine he didn't understand. "Marshal," Lieutenant Hale caught up to him, his face blue around the lips. "The heaters are still dark. The engineering team says the feedback loop from the vault fried the primary power couplings. We're on manual life support now. We've got maybe 2 hours before the carbon dioxide levels start to peak." "Any word from Thorne?" Cross asked, his hand gripping the hilt of his sidearm. "Nothing, sir. The elevator is locked. The vault has gone completely silent since the hegemony vanished." Cross cursed under his breath. The hegemony was gone, but they were still dying. It was a classic short circuit of fate. "We survived the World Eaters just to turn into ice picks." He walked into the communal mess hall, which had been turned into a makeshift shelter. Hundreds of people were packed into the room, their bodies providing the only warmth left. There was no talking, no crying, just the heavy, rhythmic sound of 1,000 people breathing. It was the sound of a species waiting for the end. Cross stood on a table, his silhouette stark against the red light. "Listen up," he shouted. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're in the deep freeze. The power is out, and it's going to get colder before it gets better." A murmur of fear ripples through the crowd. "But look at the person next to you," Cross continued, his voice gaining strength. "That's your neighbor. That's your family. That's the only heater you've got left. We survived 30 years of the hegemony because we didn't let the dark pull us apart. We're not going to let a little cold do it now. If we're going to die, we're going to die together, as humans. But I'm not planning on dying today, and neither should you." He saw a woman in the front row reach out and take the hand of an elderly man next to her. Then another person followed suit, and another. Soon, the entire room was a web of interlocking hands. It was a small, fragile gesture of unity, but in the heart of a freezing moon, it felt like a bonfire. Cross stepped down, his heart heavy. He had given them hope, but he didn't have any left for himself. He walked toward the communication terminal, hoping for a miracle. Suddenly, the red light flickered. Then, it died completely. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a low hum began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't the sound of the outpost's generators. It was deeper, more resonant. The amber light began to bleed through the floorboards. It wasn't the harsh, blinding light of a weapon. It was a soft, golden radiance that felt warm to the touch. It spread across the room, illuminating the frost on the walls and turning the breath of the crowd into golden mist. "Thorne," Cross whispered. The main screen on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't a tactical map. It was a mirror. But it wasn't reflecting the room. It was reflecting the stars. "Marshal Cross," Silas Thorne's voice came through the speakers, sounding tired but clear. "The architect has restored the power, but it's not using the couplings. It's using the thermal energy from the hegemony ships we neutralized. It's recycling the heat of the war to keep us alive." Cross stared at the screen. "How?" "The machine learned a lesson," Silas said. "It realized that preservation isn't just about stopping the enemy. It's about taking care of the people who are left behind. It's using the loom to bridge the gap between our technology and the vaults." Cross felt the warmth returning to his fingers. The air in the room was growing sweet and fresh again. He looked at the mirror on the screen. The stars were beautiful, millions of pinpricks of light in a velvet dark. For the first time in his life, he didn't see them as a battlefield. He saw them as a destination. "Is it over?" Cross asked. "No," Silas said. "The hegemony will be back. But now we know what we're protecting. We're not just protecting a moon, Marshal. We're protecting the memory of how to be kind." Cross looked at the people in the room. They were still holding hands, their faces bathed in the amber glow. They weren't afraid anymore. They were curious. "You're a hell of a philosopher for an ice pick, Thorne," Cross said, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "Get your tail back up here. We've got a lot of work to do." Inside the vault, Silas Thorne stood before the central spire, his hand resting on the glass. The architect was silent now, but he could feel its presence, a steady, pulsing awareness that felt like a friend. He looked at the shards of the loom and saw a new one forming. It was small, and its light was a soft, pale blue. He reached out and touched it. He felt a memory of a cold room, 1,000 hands linked together, and a man's voice shouting into the dark. "This is the beginning," Silas whispered. The architect's voice echoed one last time, a gentle vibration in his mind. "It is a good memory, Dr. Thorne. I will keep it safe." As Silas walked toward the lift, he realized that the turning point hadn't happened when the hegemony fled. It had happened when a battle-scarred soldier and a grieving scholar decided that the future was worth the cold. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in 2,000 years, humanity wasn't fighting it alone. They had a machine that remembered, and a people who were finally learning how to hope. But in the far reaches of the galaxy, Exarch Vane was staring at his own reflection in a dark viewport. He remembered the sorrow. He remembered the faces of the children. And he felt a new, burning hunger. Not for territory, but for an explanation. He would return, and next time, he wouldn't bring 40,000 ships. He would bring a question that could break a world. Silas stepped onto the platform and began the long ascent toward the light. He knew the challenges ahead were immense. He knew that the peace they had bought was fragile. But as he looked up at the circle of sky above the shaft, he didn't see a void. He saw a canvas. The cost of silence had been high, but the price of speaking was even higher. And Silas Thorne was ready to pay it. The golden radiance of the vault had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse, like the breathing of a colossal, slumbering beast. Silas Thorne stood in the center of the archive of the Unbroken, surrounded by floating pillars of liquid light that contained the distilled history of 1,000 lost generations. The air here was strangely sweet, smelling of ozone and distant rain, a scent that shouldn't exist 4,000 meters beneath the ice of a dead moon. He moved his hand through a stream of data, and the cortex bridge at the base of his neck hummed in response. Images flooded his mind, not the jagged, terrifying flashes of the war he had felt before, but moments of profound, ordinary beauty. He saw a wedding in a valley of purple grass under a binary sun. He felt the pride of a young engineer completing a bridge that spanned a kilometer-wide canyon. He heard a lullaby sung in a language that had been silent for 2,000 years. These were the stories the hegemony tried to eat, the architect's voice whispered, vibrating through Silas's bones. They do not just conquer territory, Silas. They conquer identity. They believe that by removing the past, they can own the future. My creators knew that a people who forget who they were are already defeated. Silas leaned against a pillar of light, his legs feeling heavy. The fatigue of the last 48 hours was finally catching up to him. Is this what we are now? Curators of a graveyard? We are the seed, Silas, the architect replied, and for the first time Silas detected a hint of something resembling hope in the machine's polyphonic tone. A seed is a memory of a forest. It waits in the dark, under the pressure of the earth, until the conditions are right to bloom. I have spent 20 centuries protecting this seed. But a seed cannot plant itself. The moment of quiet was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic pinging from the tactical overlay in Silas's vision. Red markers began to blink on the edge of the system map. Silas, we've got static. Rin's voice crackled through his headset. She sounded frantic, her words coming in short, jagged gasps. The hegemony. They didn't all leave. They left something behind. A void hunter. It's a stealth rig, Silas. It just zeroed out our 3 outer rim sensor drones. It's heading straight for the outpost. Silas stood up, the fatigue vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. A void hunter? I thought they retreated. The Exarch is a stubborn short stick. Marshal Cross's voice cut in, gravelly and cold. He's not going to walk away from a loss like that without leaving a parting gift. This hunter is a specialized unit, Silas. It's a ghost ship. Our radar can't get a lock, and our interceptors are still cooling down from the power surge. If that thing drops a kinetic payload on the outpost, we're all going to be stardust before we can say sorry. Can the architect intercept it? Silas asked, looking at the glowing spire of the vault. I can track the displacement of its drives, the architect said, its voice sharpening into its military resonance. But the hunter is operating on a localized, closed-loop logic system. It is not connected to the hegemony's primary command net. I cannot unravel it from here. It is a bullet, not a conversation. Cross, what's your status? Silas demanded. We're running on fumes, Cross replied. The Aegis I has its primary engines back online, but our targeting computers are still spitting sparks. We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. Visual tracking and manual fire. But we need to know where it's going to be, Silas. We need a lead. The architect can calculate the trajectory, Silas said, but he realized the limitation as soon as he spoke. If the architect sent the data to the Aegis I, the Void Hunter's electronic warfare suite would pick up the transmission and change course instantly. It was a cat-and-mouse game where the cat was invisible and the mouse was blind. I have to go up, Silas said, his voice quiet and firm. Like hell you do, Cross snapped. You're the only one who can talk to that machine. If you get zeroed, we lose our only ace. The architect needs a relay point closer to the surface to get a precise fix on a stealth rig, Silas argued, walking toward the lift. If I stay down here, the lag is too great. I need to get to the mid-level observation deck. It has a direct line of sight to the orbital sector. Silas, that deck hasn't been pressurized in 20 years, Rin warned. The seals are probably junk. Then I'll wear a vac suit, Silas said. Marshal, get your boys ready. When I give you the signal, you fire everything you've got at the coordinates I send. No hesitation, no questions." Cross was silent for a long moment. "You're a stubborn hull-thumper, Thorne," he said finally, and Silas could hear a grudging respect in the old soldier's voice. "Fine. We're in position. Don't make me write a letter to your ghost." As the lift began its 3,000-meter ascent, Silas looked back at the archive of the Unbroken. The golden light was fading as the vault shifted its power to the tracking sensors. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore, or even for the thousands of people in the outpost. He was fighting for the wedding in the purple grass. He was fighting for the lullaby. He was fighting for the memory of every human soul that had ever dared to hope. This is the lesson, Silas thought, as the lift lurched upward. Responsibility isn't just about protecting what we have, it's about protecting what we might become. He reached the mid-level deck and stepped out into a cavernous, dark space. The air was thin and freezing, smelling of stale dust and ancient metal. He pulled his thermal cloak tighter and checked his portable life support unit. He had 60 minutes of breathable air. He walked to the edge of the observation window, a massive pane of reinforced synthetic crystal that looked out over the jagged peaks of the Krios Mountains and the black void of space beyond. The stars were brilliant, indifferent pinpricks of light. "Architect, are you there?" Silas whispered. "I am here, Silas," the voice echoed in his mind. "I have established a secure link through your Cortex bridge. I am scanning for the gravitational wake of the hunter's engines." Silas closed his eyes, letting the machine's consciousness merge with his own. It was a dizzying, terrifying sensation. He felt the cold of the room, but he also felt the vast, empty expanse of the system. He saw the Aegis-1, a tiny, battered spark of light 10,000 kilometers away. And then he saw it. A ripple. A tiny, almost imperceptible distortion in the starlight near the third moon. "Found you," Silas thought. The Void Hunter was a sleek black needle, almost invisible against the backdrop of the void. It was moving at a staggering speed, its course plotted with a cold, predatory efficiency. It was carrying a single, high-yield kinetic penetrator, a solid slug of depleted uranium that would hit the Heliox outpost with the force of a small nuclear bomb. "I have the solution," the architect said. "I am feeding the coordinates to your mind. You must relay them to the Aegis-1 manually. Any digital transmission will be intercepted." Silas opened his eyes. He looked at the communication console, his fingers trembling with the cold. He began to dictate the numbers, his voice steady despite the shivering that was racking his body. "Cross, do you copy? Sector 7 Gamma. Altitude 85. Velocity 22,000. Leading by 5 degrees. Fire now." On the bridge of the Aegis-1, Valerius Cross didn't wait. He didn't check the math. He didn't ask for confirmation. He slammed his fist onto the manual fire override. "Loose!" he roared. A volley of heavy railgun slugs erupted from the Aegis-1's forward batteries. They streaked across the dark like falling stars, silent and deadly. For a long, agonizing second, it seemed like they would miss. The Void Hunter's engines flared as it attempted a desperate last-second maneuver. But the architect's lead was perfect. The first slug clipped the Hunter's stabilizer. The second hit the engine block. The third and fourth slammed directly into the center of the ship, detonating the kinetic payload prematurely. A blinding white light blossomed in the sky above Krios-IV, a brief, artificial star that illuminated the mountains in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a scattering of debris that would eventually burn up in the atmosphere. "Target neutralized," Lieutenant Hale's voice came through the comms, sounding breathless. "Direct hit." "Marshal, we got the ghost." Cross exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Nice shooting, Thorne. I guess you're more than just a dirt digger after all." Silas leaned his forehead against the cold crystal of the observation window. He watched the last sparks of the explosion fade into the dark. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he felt a strange, quiet peace. He had acted. He had faced the fear, and he had done what was necessary. Not for himself, but for the future. "Dr. Thorne," the architect said softly, "you have saved the outpost, but the Exarch's quest for an explanation has only begun. He saw the light of the vault. He will return, and he will not be alone." "I know," Silas whispered, "but next time we won't be hiding in the dark. We'll be waiting for him." He looked at his reflection in the glass. He didn't see a grieving scholar anymore. He saw a man who had become a bridge. And as the sun began to rise over the jagged peaks of Krios-IV, painting the ice in shades of gold and amber, Silas Thorne realized that the Great Silence was finally over. The conversation had begun, and humanity was finally ready to speak. The aftermath of the Void Hunter's destruction brought no celebration to the Heliox outpost. Instead, a grim, purposeful energy took hold. High Marshal Valerius Cross walked through the central plaza, his boots clanging on the metal deck. The heaters were working again, but the atmosphere remained chilled by the collective realization that the peace they had enjoyed was a fragile thing, bought with a coin they were only beginning to understand. He found Silas Thorne in the medical wing, sitting on the edge of a cot, while Rin Thaloris fussed over a series of thermal burns on his neck, where the Cortex bridge had overheated during the relay. "You're a real piece of work, Thorne," Cross said, leaning against the door frame. "I tell you to stay in the bunker, and you go and try to play hero in an unpressurized observation deck. You're lucky your lungs didn't turn into ice cubes." "I did what I had to," Silas replied, his voice raspy. "Rin, stop, I'm fine. Marshal, we need to talk about what's next." "Next?" Cross laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Next is we try to figure out how to keep 3,000 people from losing their heads when the rest of the hegemony fleet comes back. And they will come back. Vane isn't the type to take a bloody nose and call it a day. He's probably out there right now, calling for reinforcements from the nearest hegemony hub." "He's doing more than that," Silas said, looking Cross in the eye. "He's sending a logic plague." Cross straightened up, his face hardening. "A what?" The architect detected it during the final moments of the Void Hunter's transmission, Silas explained. "It's a counterintelligence virus. It's designed to exploit the very thing that makes the Vault so powerful, its ability to process human emotion and memory. It's a corruption of the loom. If it gets into the system, it won't just shut down the machines. It will scramble the minds of anyone connected to the net." Cross looked at the people walking past the medical wing, technicians, soldiers, parents carrying their children. "So it turns everyone into a vegetable?" "Worse," Silas said. "It amplifies our worst impulses. Fear, anger, paranoia. It turns a community into a mob. The architect says it was the weapon that finally broke the resistance 2,000 years ago. It wasn't the ships that won the war. It was the fact that the humans stopped trusting each other." Rin dropped her medical scanner, her face pale. "So we're just waiting for our brains to melt?" "Not if we change the rules of the engagement," Silas said, standing up. "The reason the logic plague works is that it targets individual nodes. It finds the cracks in a single mind and widens them. But the architect has a countermeasure. It's called the Unity Protocol." Cross crossed his arms. "I don't like the sound of that." "It's exactly what it sounds like," Silas said. "We connect everyone. Not just me. Not just the officers. Every person in the outpost. We merge our collective consciousness with the vault. We create a shared mental space where the virus can't find a foothold because there are no secrets, no isolated pockets of fear. You want to put 3,000 people on the Cortex Bridge?" Cross's voice was incredulous. "Are you out of your mind, Thorne?" "That's not a defense. That's a mass lobotomy. It's the only way to shield the outpost," Silas insisted. "If we stay separate, we're vulnerable. If we stand together, really together, we're a wall that no virus can penetrate." The Marshal shook his head. "No, I'm not authorizing that. People have a right to their own heads, Silas. You can't just flip a switch and turn us into a hive mind. We'd be no better than the hegemony." Silas walked over to Cross, his eyes burning with intensity. "Marshal, look at me. I've been inside the loom. It's not a hive. It's a harmony. You don't lose yourself. You find yourself in the context of everyone else. You see their struggles, and they see yours. You realize that your fear is their fear, and your hope is their hope. It's the ultimate act of responsibility. We take care of each other by knowing each other." Cross looked away, his jaw working. He thought about the 30 years he had spent as a soldier, the walls he had built around his own heart to keep out the grief and the guilt. He thought about the secrets he had kept, the friends he had lost, and the orders he had given that still kept him awake at night. "I don't think I can do that, Thorne," Cross whispered, his voice suddenly sounding very old. "I don't think I want anyone seeing what's inside my head." Silas reached out and put a hand on Cross's shoulder. "That's why you're the most important part of this, Valerius. If the man who carries the most weight is willing to share it, then everyone else will follow. The hegemony wins because they make us feel alone. We win because we refuse to be." The alarm system began to wail, a high-pitched, discordant sound that set Silas's teeth on edge. "They're here!" Lieutenant Hale's voice came over the intercom, sounding distorted and frantic. 6 hegemony cruisers just dropped out of warp. And, Marshal, something's wrong with the ship's computers. They're laughing. The logic plague had arrived. On the monitors in the medical wing, the tactical maps began to dissolve into chaos. Icons shifted and warped, turning into grotesque, grinning faces. The lights in the outpost flickered between a nauseating green and a violent red. In the hallway, a fight broke out between 2 technicians who had been friends for a decade. Paranoia was spreading like a wildfire. "Marshal, we're losing them!" Rin shouted, pointing to a monitor that showed the communal shelters. People were screaming, clawing at the walls, their faces twisted in a terror that had no source. Cross looked at the chaos, then back at Silas. He saw the architect's amber light pulsing at the base of Silas's neck, a steady, calm beacon in the midst of the madness. He thought about the children he had seen in the freezer. He thought about the future they would never have if he chose his own privacy over their survival. He straightened his back, his face a mask of iron-hard determination. "All right, Thorne," Cross said, his voice ringing out over the sirens. "Flip the switch. But if I wake up and I'm a toaster, I'm going to kill you twice." Silas didn't waste a second. He closed his eyes and reached out to the architect. "Now." The vault responded with a surge of power that rocked the entire moon. A massive wave of golden light swept through the outpost, passing through walls, floors, and people like a warm summer breeze. Silas felt the connection snap into place. Suddenly, he wasn't just Silas Thorne. He was Rin, feeling her fierce, protective love for her machines. He was Lieutenant Hale, feeling the crushing weight of his duty. He was the woman in the mess hall, feeling the soft warmth of her child's hand. And he was Valerius Cross. He felt the marshal's grief for his lost daughter, a cold, sharp stone in the center of his chest. He felt the guilt of every soldier he had sent to their death. He felt the profound, aching loneliness of a man who had spent his life being a fortress. But as the connections multiplied, the grief didn't crush him. It was shared. The stone in Cross's chest began to soften as 3,000 people reached out and touched it, offering their own sorrows as a counterbalance. The guilt was met with understanding, and the loneliness was drowned out by a chorus of 3,000 voices saying, "We see you. You are not alone." The logic plague, a jagged violet static that had been tearing through the outpost's network, suddenly hit the wall of the Unity. It tried to find a crack, a secret, a hidden fear to exploit. But there were no cracks. There were no secrets. The outpost was a single coherent soul, bound together by the amber light of the vault and the shared truth of their own humanity. The violet static recoiled, unable to process the complexity and the honesty of the connection. It flickered and died, its malicious code unraveling into nothingness. On the tactical monitors, the grinning faces vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp lines of the hegemony fleet. The lights returned to a steady, warm white. The fighting in the corridors stopped as people looked at each other with tears in their eyes, their hands still linked. Marshal Cross stood in the medical wing, his eyes wet. He looked at Silas, and for the first time in 30 years, the wall was gone. "Thank you," Valerius whispered. But the battle wasn't over. Outside, the 6 hegemony cruisers were positioning themselves for an orbital bombardment. They didn't understand why the logic plague had failed, but they still had the raw physical power to destroy the moon. Silas looked at the tactical map. He felt the collective strength of the outpost flowing through him, a reservoir of power that the architect was already beginning to tap into. Architect, Silas thought, and his thought was echoed by 3,000 others. Show them what we can do when we're not afraid. The vault's golden spire flared with a brilliance that rivaled the sun. This time, the unraveling was not a subtle psychological trick. It was a projection of the Unity itself. A wave of pure, coherent energy erupted from the moon, striking the hegemony cruisers with the force of 1,000,000 shared memories. It didn't destroy the ships. It didn't kill the crews. It simply made them see. For a single, profound second, every alien on those ships felt the weight of the human heart. They felt the weddings, the lullabies, the grief, and the hope. They felt the sheer, impossible stubbornness of a species that refused to be forgotten. The hegemony cruisers shuddered. Their violet engines flickered and died. Their weapons systems went cold. They sat in orbit, silent and unmoving, their crews overwhelmed by a reality they were never designed to process. "They're leaving," Lieutenant Hale whispered, his voice echoing through the shared mind. They're just turning around." One by one, the cruisers engaged their warp drives and vanished into the dark. They didn't retreat in fear. They retreated in confusion, their certainty shattered by the truth of what they had encountered. The Unity protocol slowly disengaged, the golden light fading back into the floorboards. Silas Thorne collapsed back onto his cot, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the connection. He felt empty, but it was a good kind of empty. The emptiness of a vessel that had been used for a great purpose. Marshal Cross walked over to the window and looked up at the stars. He was still the High Marshal, and he still had a moon to protect. But he was different now. The fortress had become a bridge. "We did it," Rin said, sitting down next to Silas. "We actually did it." "For now," Silas said, his eyes closing. "But the galaxy is a big place, Rin. And now it knows we're here." Cross turned back to the room. "Then we'd better start getting ready," he said, his voice no longer a growl, but a steady, calm resonance. "We've got a future to build. And this time, we're going to build it together." As the outpost returned to its normal rhythm, a new song began to rise, a quiet, humming melody that came from the people as they worked, a shared rhythm that they had brought back from the Unity. It was a song of responsibility, of courage, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. And deep beneath the ice, the architect watched, and it began to plan for the next 1,000 years. Because it knew that the seed had finally begun to bloom. The silence that followed the withdrawal of the hegemony fleet was unlike any silence Silas Thorne had ever known. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy quiet of the ice cap, nor was it the sterile stillness of a vacuum. It was the silence of a long-held breath finally being released. Inside the Heliox outpost, the amber glow of the vault had softened to a pale, comforting honey hue, illuminating the frost-dusted corridors where 3,000 souls were currently coming back to themselves. The Unity protocol had disengaged 10 minutes ago, but the residue of the connection lingered like the ghost of a symphony. Silas sat on the edge of a supply crate in the main hangar, his head in his hands. He could still feel them, the echoes of 1,000 different lives. He felt the phantom itch of a scar on someone's shoulder, the lingering taste of a synthetic apple someone else had eaten for breakfast, and, most poignantly, the cooling embers of 3,000 different fears. "It's quiet," Rin Thaloris whispered, sitting down beside him. She looked exhausted, her grease-stained coveralls torn at the knee, but there was a clarity in her eyes that Silas had never seen before. Usually, Rin was a woman of sharp edges and defensive sarcasm, a gearhead who preferred the company of hydraulic pumps to human beings. Now, she just looked open. "Too quiet?" Silas asked, looking up. "No," Rin said, shaking her head. "Just honest. I can't explain it, Silas. I spent 20 years thinking that if people knew what I was really thinking, they'd think I was a total short stick. I thought my anger was a secret. But when we were all connected, I saw that everyone else was just as angry and just as scared of being found out. It's hard to be a jerk to someone when you've felt their heartbeat inside your own chest." Silas nodded. He looked across the hangar. Usually, after a high-stress event, like an orbital bombardment threat, the outpost would be a hive of frantic activity. Soldiers checking weapons, technicians bickering over power loads, the air thick with street slang and muttered curses. Instead, people were moving with a strange, deliberate grace. He saw two men who had been bitter rivals for a decade sharing a single thermos of tea, speaking in low, respectful tones. He saw a group of children playing near a pile of scrap metal, their laughter ringing out without the usual edge of frantic anxiety. "The architect did more than save us from a virus," Silas said. "It showed us the mirror." A heavy footfall sounded on the metal gantry above them. High Marshal Valerius Cross descended the stairs, his movements slow and stiff. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 48 hours, but the iron in his expression had been replaced by something more resembling worn granite, solid but textured by time and weather. "Thorne," Cross said, acknowledging Silas with a curt nod. He didn't use his usual barking tone. He sounded like a man who had finally put down a weight he'd been carrying for half a century. "Marshal," Silas stood up. "Status report?" "The hegemony cruisers have cleared the system's edge," Cross said, leaning against a support pillar. They didn't even stop to pick up their sensor buoys. They just pulled the pin and ghosted. Lieutenant Hale says the drive signatures are consistent with a full retreat to their primary sector. And the outpost? We're stable. Life support is back to 90%. We lost some structural integrity in the outer domes during the pressure shifts, but we're holding. Cross paused, his gaze drifting to the group of children. The people. They're asking questions, Silas. They want to know if it's going to happen again. If we're going to stay connected. What did you tell them? I told them that the choice is theirs, Cross said, and for the first time, Silas saw the Marshal smile, a small, tired, but genuine expression. I told them that the bridge is open, but no one is forcing them to cross it. Though, from the looks of it, a lot of them aren't in any hurry to go back to being strangers. Cross walked over to the edge of the hangar bay, looking out through the reinforced viewport at the white expanse of Krios-IV. The World Eater crater was still visible in the distance, a jagged black scar against the pristine snow, but the amber light from the vault was reflecting off the ice, making the whole landscape look like it was made of gold. I spent my whole life being a fortress, Thorne, Cross whispered, almost to himself. I thought that was my responsibility, to be the one who didn't break, to be the one who kept the secrets and made the hard calls so no one else had to. But inside the unity, I realized that my fortress was actually a prison. I wasn't protecting those people from the hegemony. I was protecting myself from having to care about them as individuals. It's a hell of a thing to realize you've been doing your job wrong for 30 years. You weren't doing it wrong, Valerius, Silas said, stepping up beside him. You were doing it with the tools you had. We were all survivors. And survivors don't build bridges, they build walls. Well, the walls are down now, Cross said, and I don't think we can put them back up, not after seeing what we saw. Rin stood up and joined them at the window. So, what's the play, Silas? Does the architect go back to sleep? Do we bury the vault again and pretend we're just a bunch of ice diggers? The architect spoke to Silas then, its voice a gentle vibration at the base of his skull. I cannot return to dormancy, Dr. Thorne. The seed has cracked. The question has been asked, and the galaxy is listening. The hegemony will return, perhaps not tomorrow, or even in 10 years, but they will return. They now know that Earth is not a graveyard, but a lighthouse, and a lighthouse that is dark is an invitation to disaster. We stay active, Silas said aloud, his voice firm. We don't hide anymore. We take the archive of the unbroken and we turn it into a university. We invite the other silent species. We show them that there is a third way, not just surrender or erasure, but integration. Integration, Cross mused. The hegemony won't like that. It challenges their entire hierarchy. Good, Silas said. Let it challenge them. Let them see that a civilization isn't measured by how many ships it has, but by how many stories it remembers. As the sun began to set over the jagged peaks of Krios-IV, the three of them stood in the golden light, a soldier, an engineer, and a scholar. They were a ragtag assembly, survivors of a war that had been fought in the shadows for 2,000 years. But they weren't survivors anymore. They were the architects of a new era. The responsibility was no longer a burden of fear. It was a promise of potential. And as Silas looked at the stars, he didn't see enemies. He saw students. He saw partners. He saw a forest that was just beginning to grow. 6 months had passed since the Great Unraveling, and the face of Krios-IV had been transformed. No longer a desolate, gray outpost hidden beneath the permafrost, the moon had become a vibrant hub of crystalline architecture and golden light. The architect had guided the colonists in expanding the surface facilities, using the thermal energy of the moon's core to create climate-controlled biodomes where green things, real, living plants from the Old World's archives, were beginning to push through the soil for the first time in 2,000 years. Silas Thorne walked through the central plaza of the newly christened Library of Light. He was 51 years old now, and the gray in his hair seemed more like a badge of office than a sign of age. He was dressed in a simple, dark tunic, his cortex bridge pulsing with a soft, constant amber light. He wasn't just a scholar anymore. He was the dean of the archive, the bridge between human intuition and machine memory. The library was crowded, but they weren't just humans anymore. 2 months ago, a small, long-range transport from the Xylos sector had arrived, a species of bioluminescent beings who had been hiding in the rings of a gas giant for 5 centuries. They had heard the song of the Unity and had come to see if the rumors were true. Now, they were in the archive, sharing their own history with human students, weaving their glowing patterns into the loom of souls. Silas stopped at a fountain in the center of the plaza. The water was recycled, but it moved with a natural, splashing rhythm that calmed his mind. He saw High Marshal Valerius Cross sitting on a nearby bench. Cross had retired from active command, handing the iron baton to the younger generation. He now spent his days teaching tactical history, not how to win wars, but how to prevent them. "You look like you're actually enjoying yourself, Valerius," Silas said, taking a seat next to him. "It's a strange feeling, Thorne," Cross admitted, leaning back and closing his eyes to the artificial sunlight. "I spent 35 years waiting for the sky to fall. Now, I spend my time worrying about whether the Xylos delegates are going to like the new nutrient paste we've developed. It's a different kind of stress. A better one. How's the new class?" "Stubborn," Cross chuckled. "They don't want to hear about the old formations. They want to talk about empathy shielding and narrative diversion. They think a railgun is a museum piece. I told them they were lucky it is." Silas looked up at the transparent roof of the dome. Beyond the glass, the stars were as bright as ever, but they no longer felt cold. "We're doing it, Valerius. We're building the forest." Cross opened his eyes and looked at Silas. "We are. But I still check the long-range scanners every morning, Thorne. Old habits die hard." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Silas said. "We need the sentinels as much as we need the scholars." Silas stood up and began to walk toward the great spire. He had a lecture to give to the first-year class of the academy. As he moved through the halls, he saw Rin Thaloris working on a massive golden relay station. She wasn't just fixing it. She was improving it, her hands moving with a grace that was almost like a dance. She looked up and waved, a hull thumper who had found poetry in the machine. Inside the great spire, Silas stood before the central light of the architect. Thousands of shards of the loom drifted around him, a shimmering galaxy of human and alien experience. He felt the presence of the machine, no longer a master or a tool, but a partner. "Are you ready, Silas?" the architect asked. "I am," Silas thought. He turned to the auditorium, where hundreds of students, human and Xylos alike, were waiting. They were the future. They were the ones who would carry the responsibility of this moon out into the wider galaxy. They were the reason he had spent 20 years digging in the dirt. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, he let his mind drift back through the journey. "I spent 45 years of my life obsessed with the past, because I was too afraid to face the future. I thought that by digging up the bones of our ancestors, I could somehow find a map that would tell us how to survive the dark. I treated history like a fortress, something to hide inside when the present became too loud. I thought that to be responsible meant to be a guardian of shadows. But standing here today, looking at the faces of people who are no longer afraid to know each other, I realize how wrong I was. Responsibility isn't about guarding the past, it's about tending to the present so that the future has a place to grow. It's about the courage to be vulnerable, to tear down the walls we build around our own hearts, and to realize that our greatest strength isn't our ability to destroy, but our ability to empathize. I used to think that the Great Silence was a tragedy, but now I see it was a long, cold winter that we had to endure to appreciate the spring. I am no longer just a man who digs for ghosts. I am a man who plants seeds. And though I may not live to see the full forest, I can feel the warmth of the sun on my face today, and that is enough. We are the architects of our own hope, and as long as we remember each other, the dark will never truly win. Silas finished his thought, and a profound silence settled over the room. It wasn't the silence of boredom, but the silence of understanding. He saw a young human girl in the front row reach out and touch the glowing limb of a Xylos student. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but to Silas, it was the most important thing in the universe. He smiled at them, a man who had finally found his purpose. I spent 45 years building a wall around my heart, thinking it was a fortress, only to realize it was just a tomb. I wonder, what are the walls you have built in your own life to keep your secrets and your fears safe? Are those walls truly protecting you, or are they just keeping the light from reaching the people who might help you carry the weight? Silas Thorne turned away from the podium and walked toward the window, looking out at the golden moon. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried seed he had found in the archive, a real oak seed from the old world. He pressed it into a small pot of soil on the windowsill and whispered a word of encouragement to the dark earth. He didn't need a machine to tell him it would grow. He could already feel the life waiting inside.